It started with the cold. Not the kind that merely nipped at your fingertips or made you pull your coat tighter. No, this cold crept in slowly, over years, like regret. It carved itself into the walls, into the floorboards, into the marrow of my bones. I remember thinking once that if I sat still long enough, maybe the cold would turn me to stone and finally let me stop feeling. Maybe that was what I wanted, not death, just stillness. Just enough quiet inside to match the quiet out. My cabin sat on the edge of nowhere, where the wind never stopped asking questions no one was left to answer. It had been years since I'd heard a voice that wasn't my own. Longer still, since one had spoken without judgment. When the last grave was dug, when the final piece of the past was buried beneath frostbitten earth, I stopped counting time. The world outside had turned white and mute, and so had I. I learned to live inside that silence. It became my companion. The way snow wraps around a fence post and pretends it was never there. The way old photographs fade until even the faces look like strangers. I stopped speaking because there was no one left to listen. And the few who came close, those rare traders or hunters, didn't look at me like a person. I was a story to them, a ghost in the woods, the widow in the red house who didn't cry at the funeral. But I wasn't always like this. There was once music here. There was once warmth. Now, only the fire moved. And even that, only when I fed it. Some nights, I left it to die, just to see how cold it could really get. I'd sit by the window wrapped in quilts, breath fogging the glass, listening to the wind whisper old names through the trees. I'd tell myself it was just the wind. Then came the knock. I hadn't heard a knock in years, not since the sheriff came to tell me the bodies wouldn't be coming home. Not since a stranger tried to barter venison for a night indoors and left with a broken nose when his hand reached for my wrist. No one knocked here, not anymore. That night, I was bent by the stove, coaxing a stubborn flame from kindling soaked in too much sap. I'd given up tea weeks ago. Water would have to do. My fingers were numb from splitting wood. My back sore from hauling snow out of the chicken coop. I thought it was just the wind until it repeated. Steady. 7 beats. Not frantic, not urgent. Deliberate. I froze. For a moment, I thought my mind had finally cracked open from the cold. That maybe I'd conjured the sound the same way I conjured voices sometimes. Memories that slipped between the floorboards and laughed when I begged them to stay. But the knock came again. I moved without meaning to, drawn forward like a thread being pulled. Each step felt too loud. The floor groaned under my weight, betraying my presence. My hand hovered over the latch. I didn't breathe. My heart, asleep for so long, slammed itself awake. I hadn't realized how empty the cabin had become until the presence of something some outside reminded me what space felt like when it was shared. I opened the door. They stood like statues cut from the night. 7 of them, cloaked in snow and silence. The wind whipped around their forms but didn't dare enter. I looked at them, and they looked back not with hunger, not with menace, but with a kind of patience that made the hairs on my arms rise. No one spoke, not at first. Then one stepped forward, the tallest. His eyes caught the light of the hearth behind me. They weren't cruel eyes, but they had seen things. Things that left marks deeper than scars. Still, I didn't move, I didn't speak, I didn't know how to. But he did. He nodded just one scene, that was enough. I stepped aside. They filed in without sound, removing their boots at the door, bringing with them the scent of fire, snow, and something older. Something that reminded me of places I'd only dreamed of when the world still felt wide. They didn't touch anything, didn't ask for anything. They simply sat close to the stove, letting the heat revive them. One of them shivered and wrapped his hands around his knees. Another closed his eyes as if he'd finally found a place safe enough to sleep. And still, no one spoke. I moved without thinking. I ladled what stew I had into bowls. Thin broth, mostly root vegetables. Barely enough for one, but I made it stretch. When I handed it to the tall one, he met my eyes. He took the bowl like it mattered. Like it was more than food. Like it was dignity. That night, They slept on the floor. And I didn't sleep at all, because something had shifted. In the air, in me. Like a match struck in the dark. Too small to warm the whole room, but enough to remind you light still exists. It had been 3 days since they arrived. The storm had only worsened on the second night, swallowing the forest, the creek, the barn, and the sky. It clawed at the cabin like a living thing, howling down the chimney and rattling the shutters, as if it wanted to devour what little warmth remained in the world. But inside, the air was still and heavy, like the pause after a prayer too long unanswered. I didn't know why I let them stay. Maybe I had nothing left to lose. Maybe I'd already died in some quiet way, and this was just the echo of a woman trying to remember how it felt to be needed. Or maybe I just couldn't bear the idea of turning away warmth, not when I knew too well what it meant to be turned away. They didn't ask questions. They didn't offer names. They moved like ghosts in familiar places, not unwelcome, just uncertain. Each man had his own rhythm. One cleaned his blade in slow, reverent motions. Another spent hours carving something from a pale branch, shaving slivers so thin they curled like frozen breath. One spent most of his time outside, regardless of the cold, walking the perimeter of the cabin with steps that spoke of habit, not fear. But him, the one with a scar across his jaw, he didn't roam. He stayed close, always within a few paces of the stove or the window. He never touched anything without intention, never spoke unless it was needed. And when he did speak, it felt like the earth leaning closer to listen. He never told me his name, not yet. But there was a weight to his silence that felt familiar. Not the silence of men who want something. Not the silence of power. This was the quiet of someone who had known ruin, worn it like a coat, and learned to walk with its weight. And when our eyes met, I didn't look away. I wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The third morning brought a kind of thaw. Not in the snow, it still curled heavy on the roof, but in the space between us. I woke early, long before the sun climbed over the treetops, and found him outside, stacking wood in perfect symmetry, like each piece mattered. He moved with purpose, but not rush. "Why do you do that?" I asked, the words slipping from my mouth before I realized I meant to speak. He didn't turn around, just answered, "Because you shouldn't have to." I watched him then, not just with my eyes, but with some old part of me I thought I'd buried under grief. Something stirred, something warm and wrong and right all at once. Back inside, the others were waking. They moved in quiet harmony, boiling snow for water, stoking the fire, feeding the stove as if it were a creature to be kept alive. I ladled what little porridge we had into bowls, watching their hands move with care, not desperation. These were not beggars. These were not thieves. They were men who had carried winter on their backs and knew the price of taking too much. Still, I watched them. Still, I waited. I didn't trust easily anymore. Not after the baby, not after Henry, not after the whispers. Grief teaches you the art of survival, but never the language of belonging. And yet, here they were. The day passed slowly, snow falling like feathers outside the window. I busied myself with chores I had done 1,000 times, alone mending socks, straightening books I didn't read anymore, wiping the same corner of the table out of habit. But that evening, something changed. He carved something, a bird, I think, and left it near the fire where I'd find it. A hawk, smooth and round, its wings tucked close like it was guarding something precious. He didn't say it was for me. He didn't need to. When I held it, I felt seen. Not watched, not observed. Seen. That night, I didn't sleep in the loft. I stayed near the fire, just like them. He laid out his furs closer than usual, not touching, just near. I felt the heat of him even through the space between us. It wasn't a longing kind of heat. It was safety. It was breath. It was the way home might feel if you'd never had one. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Sometimes I caught him watching Menot like a man studies a woman, but like a traveler memorizes the stars before a long journey. That night, the wind howled less. The silence was no longer a burden. It was a companion. In the morning, I found the hawk again. I'd left it by the hearth, but surely had moved it to the table where I took my breakfast, a silent reminder that I wasn't invisible anymore. I traced its wings with my fingers and let myself believe in something small. Not hope, not yet, but something near it. We went outside together that day. He said he'd clear the chicken coop. I followed without thinking. The snow was waist-high in places. The world looked like it had never known green. He used the axe with efficiency, clearing ice and shoveling paths with smooth, practiced movements. At one point, I slipped. I didn't fall, but my foot caught a hidden patch of ice, and I gasped. He was beside me before the sound finished, his hand on my elbow, steadying, strong. I froze not from the cold, but from the contact. It had been years since anyone had touched me with care. I looked up, and for the first time, I saw it. Not his face, not his body, but the thing behind his eyes. Recognition? Like maybe, in another life, we had done this before. And maybe in that life, we'd been something. Something safe. Something whole. He didn't speak. Neither did he. But from that moment on, the silence between us changed. It wasn't a wall. It was a door. And I wasn't afraid to open it. That night, he brought in more firewood than I'd seen stacked in years. He left it by the door without a word. And beside it, another carving. This one, a wolf. Eyes closed, head bowed, like it was listening for something lost. I sat at the table for a long time after he'd gone to sleep, holding that wolf, staring into the fire. And for the first time in a very long time, I didn't feel alone. The snow had stopped falling that morning, but the stillness it left behind was not peace. It was a hush, like the breath held before something unspoken arrives. I stood by the window, fingers brushing against the frost-laced glass, watching the trees shiver in the distance. They whispered like they always did, but something in their song had changed. It wasn't just wind anymore, it was warning. He was already outside when I stepped onto the porch. His back was to me, axe swinging in steady rhythm, carving lines through silence like a man who knew what it meant to be watched. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The way his body moved tense, deliberate told me enough. Something had shifted. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from fear, not entirely. It was something older, like the stirring of instinct. I lay in bed with my eyes open, staring at the ceiling, listening to every groan the cabin made as it settled. It was old, this place. So was the silence. But lately, the quiet between the cracks felt too loud, like it was holding its breath. I rose before the sun and wrapped my shawl tight. The air bit sharper that morning. Not colder, just hungrier. When I opened the door, I saw them. 3 sets of tracks along the edge of the tree line. Not deer, not elk. Boots. Wide strides. Deep imprints. They hadn't come close to the house yet, but they were close enough to be deliberate. Close enough to be real. I didn't call out. I didn't need to. He appeared from behind the barn, eyes sharp, jaw set like stone. He saw the tracks. He didn't say a word. Just crouched near one, fingertips grazing the snow like a man listening for its story. His breath rose steady in the cold, but I saw it then just for a flash the weight of recognition in his shoulders. He'd seen these kinds of prints before. He stood slowly and walked past me, heading toward the woods with the same grace he always had, like wind with purpose. I watched him go, part of me wanting to call out, to stop him, to tell him not to follow ghosts into trees. But I didn't. I just waited. The minutes dragged like hours. When he returned, the look in his eyes had changed. "They're not passing through," he finally said that night as he sat sharpening a blade by the fire. "They're circling." That was all. I didn't ask more. I didn't need to. From that day on, the cabin changed. Not physically, but in rhythm. The quiet we once shared became alert. I found myself moving softer, breathing quieter, like every sound might give us away. He never said we were in danger, but I could feel it in the way he lingered by the windows, the way he paced before nightfall, the way his hand now rested near the hilt of the blade even in sleep. The other men had left days ago, disappearing into the snow like ghosts returning home. He remained. Tojo. His name felt strange in my mouth, so I only ever spoke it in my mind, but it anchored me. He was no longer a visitor. He moved like someone who belonged. But I could tell the way he listened to the wind he'd been hunted before. Each day he worked as though time were short, reinforcing the barn, rebalancing the fence posts, dragging heavy logs near the house. Not for warmth. For barricades. When I asked if he thought they'd come closer, he simply nodded once. That was all I got. That was all I needed. I began noticing the way he looked at Menno with hunger. Not with grief, but with awareness. Like he saw me as part of the place now, not a burden or a task, but something worth protecting. And I realized with startling clarity that I had stopped being afraid of the dark. I still feared the world, yes, but not the dark. Not anymore. One evening, I found him carving again. Another hawk. The first he'd given me still sat near my bedside. This one was different. Not angry like the second, not smooth like the first. This one had wings outstretched, as if in motion. I watched him, his hands steady despite the tension in the air. I wanted to ask him what it meant, why he carved, why he chose hawks, but I didn't. I simply brought him warm bread and honey, the last of both. He didn't thank me. He just nodded. That small, silent gesture that had begun to mean everything between us. That night, I couldn't sleep again. I stood near the window long after the fire had burned low, watching the trees, watching the dark, and then I saw it. A flicker. Movement at the edge of the woods, not animal, human. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. I stepped back, heart racing. My hands trembled as I reached for the rifle. I hadn't touched it in years. It still smelled like ash and regret. I didn't know if it worked. I didn't know if I'd be brave enough to find out. But I held it. He was already by the door before I spoke, like he'd felt it too. He looked at me, then at the rifle, then out the window. His expression didn't change, but his body tensed like a wire pulled taut. I followed his gaze. But the shadow was gone. Nothing but snow and trees again. They're testing the edges, he said. I nodded, not trusting my voice. After that night, he began keeping watch outside. Not just during the day, but after dark too. He slept in shifts, sometimes not at all. I offered to take turns, to sit with him. He refused, not out of pride, but protection. His silence was no longer just weight, it was armor. One morning, I woke to find a rabbit skinned and cleaned on the porch. Another gift, another act of care. I cooked it with the last of the dried herbs. We ate together in silence. I wanted to ask him if he thought we'd be okay. But instead, I asked if he ever missed the noise. He looked up, eyes calm. No, he said, noise is what gets men killed. His words echoed in my chest long after they were gone. Later that day, I found him staring at the hawk carving by the hearth. He picked it up, turning it in his hand, then set it down without a word. Something in his face had changed. I couldn't name it, but it made the air feel thinner. That evening, the wind picked up again. Not a storm. Not yet, but a promise. He sat near the door, blade across his lap, eyes fixed on the dark outside. I watched him from the stairs, holding the hawk in my hands. For the first time in years, I didn't feel alone, not really, but I could feel something approaching. Not just footsteps in snow, but something deeper, something final. The quiet between us wasn't comfort anymore. It was countdown. The silence that once comforted me had started to turn cruel. It followed me like a ghost haunting the halls, slinking behind me in the kitchen, lying in wait near the window. I had known quiet for years, but this quiet? This one felt like it was breathing down my neck. Each morning I checked the snow for tracks, and each morning they came closer. Sometimes they disappeared for a day or two. That was worse, because I knew then that they were watching just better than I was. Tojo had started sleeping in shifts. He never told me when he was awake or when he was pretending. His presence in the cabin became something in the walls, like the beams themselves trusted him more than they trusted me. But I watched him too, and I learned. His fingers were calloused in places a farmer's shouldn't be. Not from tools, from rope, from triggers, from knives. He moved too carefully to be untrained. His silence wasn't the quiet of a man with nothing to say it, was the silence of a man who knew that sound cost lives. One night, he returned from the woods later than usual. His eyes darted quicker than before. His breathing was shallow, and I saw something then blood. Not his. A smear across his collarbone like a red thread frayed at both ends. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. That night, he boarded the back windows. That night, we didn't eat. That night, something howled, not a wolf, not anything I could name. And the sound didn't fade. It echoed through the trees, and every time I thought it was over, it returned closer, deeper, wrong. I pressed my hands to my ears and stared into the fire. Tojo didn't flinch. He just kept sharpening his blade. The next day, I asked him because the silence was no longer a balm, but a burden. "Who are they?" He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, without blinking, "Not men anymore." I didn't ask what that meant. I just nodded and began boiling water, because it was the only thing I could control. He began drawing maps in the snow behind the cabin. Not of the land, of patterns, patrols, where footprints appeared and disappeared, where birds stopped singing, where bones were found. Not animals, I knew that much. He started talking more, just barely. Warnings, instructions. He told me which room to run to if the door was breached. He showed me how to bolt it. He left a second blade under my bed. I didn't sleep that night either. Then one morning, everything changed. The door was ajar, just slightly, just enough. He always locked it, always. But that morning, it was open, and the wind was blowing in hot snow, ash. I called out. No answer. I stepped outside, barefoot, breath hitching in my chest. The world was too still. The trees were silent, the birds gone. I turned the corner of the cabin, heart pounding, expecting to find him, but there was only blood. A trail. Not much. Just enough to say he left fast, and not by choice. I grabbed the axe and followed. Every instinct told me not to. Every whisper of survival screamed at me to turn back. But I couldn't. Not anymore. I wasn't the woman I used to be, the one who hid behind curtains and locked herself inside grief. He had changed that. Or maybe the fear had. I followed the trail into the trees, deeper than I had gone in years. The snow crunched louder than it should have. The trees leaned closer than they used to. The path wasn't one he had cleared, it was one he had avoided. Until now, after what felt like hours, I saw it. A shape. Slumped. It was him. But he was not alone. They were there. 3 of them. Not wearing uniforms. Not speaking. Just standing too still, too wrong. Like scarecrows with breath. Tojo was on his knees, hands behind his head. His face was bloodied, but his eyes were alert, and when he saw me, his expression didn't show surprise. He had known I would follow, and that terrified me. One of them turned toward me. Its face, or what should have been one, was wrapped in cloth, but not for warmth, for hiding. Its hands were gloved, fingers twitching as though the act of standing still was too much to bear. I raised the axe. I didn't know what I planned to do, but I raised it anyway. And that was enough. They moved. Fast. Too fast. The first one lunged, and Tojo swept his leg, knocking it off balance. The second turned toward me, and I swung blindly. Wood cracked. Something fell. He didn't look. Tojo roared, not like a man, but like something cornered. He tore free and tackled the third, slamming it into the trunk of a pine. Blood splattered the snow. The first one rose again. I stumbled back, breath ragged. And then, a gunshot. It wasn't ours. They scattered like rats. Not because they feared death, because they feared being seen. Tojo grabbed my arm. We didn't speak. We ran. All the way back. All the way home. We barred the door, every window, every crawl space, every secret panel. Then we collapsed. He looked at me, eyes searching. "You followed," he said finally. I nodded. "I'm not who you think I am," he added. "I never thought you were anyone else," I replied. The silence that followed wasn't fear anymore. It was understanding. We didn't sleep that night. But we weren't alone. Not anymore. The cabin was no longer a shelter, it was a cage, with shadows pressing against the walls. After the attack, the air inside became heavier, thicker, like the world outside had breathed poison into our sanctuary. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw their silhouettes, those wrong, silent figures from the woods, moving like broken clockwork. Tojo didn't sleep either. He sat by the fire with a map and 3 knives, drawing, marking, muttering things in a language I didn't recognize. He didn't say where they came from. He didn't need to. I could feel it now. Deep in my bones, they had always been here, waiting, watching, rotting behind the trees like memories we chose to forget. Something had changed in the forest. It wasn't just the attackers, or the trails, or the blood. It was deeper. The trees themselves creaked louder now. The wind carried whispers that didn't belong to the air. The snow melted in strange spiral patterns in the clearings. Birds didn't return. And the fire crackled blue. It was on the 3rd night after the attack that I found Tojo outside, kneeling by the creek. He was whispering, "To no one." I stepped closer. His eyes were closed, his hands buried in the mud. His lips moved like he was praying, but his voice wasn't calm. It was angry, bitter, like each word tasted like ash. And the water, it didn't ripple naturally. It recoiled, pulling away from his touch like it feared him. I stepped on a branch. He turned. His eyes had changed. Not glowing, not monstrous, just older, wiser. Like the boy was being peeled away, and something far more dangerous was underneath. "You're not safe here anymore," he said softly. "They know you." I asked him what that meant. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up, dripping with river mud, and said, "We have to go into the forest." I told him he was insane. He agreed. But we went anyway. We packed nothing, just 2 knives, 1 flask, and the box. I hadn't seen it until that day, a rusted iron box buried beneath the floorboards in the corner room. He had unearthed it without hesitation, like he'd always known where it was. It was cold to the touch, even by winter's standards. He carried it like it could burn through his chest if he held it too long. We walked into the trees before sunrise. The snow had stopped, but the sky was gray. Not cloudy, just gray. Like color had given up. We passed places I didn't know existed. Ruins. Stones covered in ancient carvings. Places where the trees grew in perfect spirals or not at all. Places where the earth still bore scorch marks older than memory. Tojo told me not to speak. I didn't ask why. I knew. There were rules here. Ancient ones. Breathing things that hated noise. And truth. Around midday, we reached a circle of stones buried in frost. The trees didn't grow here. The wind didn't blow. It was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, and for the first time in years, I hated the sound of it. Tojo knelt in the center, placed the box down, and whispered a name. That's when I saw it. The tree. It hadn't been there before. Not really. But it stood now, taller than any pine, covered in symbols that looked like they'd been carved with teeth. Ropes hung from its branches. Not new, not old. Just timeless. And at its base bones, arranged in a perfect spiral. He opened the box. Inside, cloth. Black. Wet. Moving. Not alive. Not dead. I backed away, but something rooted my feet to the ground. The cold? No. Something older. Tojo reached inside and pulled out the mask. At least I thought it was a mask. It looked like a face. Stretched too thin over bone, eyes too wide, mouth stitched shut. He held it with reverence. Then he placed it at the base of the tree. The wind returned. So did the sound. A howl, not from an animal. From the forest. Like the land itself had taken a breath for the first time in years. The bones shook. So did the tree. So did I. Then nothing. He turned to me, and for a second, he looked smaller. Not like a child. Not like a soldier. Just human. I needed you here, he said, because I couldn't face it alone. I didn't understand what we'd done. I didn't know what the box was. But I saw the way the sky began to darken, not with clouds, but with something thicker like dusk had been pulled out of the earth and smeared across the sky. We ran, not because something chased us, but because we had called something, and it was coming. When we returned to the cabin, everything had changed. It wasn't burnt. It wasn't broken. But it wasn't ours anymore. The windows were fogged from the inside. The door stood open, and in the hearth, the fire burned green. Tojo didn't step inside. He waited. So did I. Then, from within the cabin, I heard her voice. My daughter's. But she had been gone for 9 years. Still, I heard it. Mom? I almost moved. Almost. But Tojo grabbed my arm, eyes wild with panic. It's not her, he said. It wears them. It wears memories. I broke then. Tears. Real ones. Not from fear, but from rage, from longing, from the cruelty of it all. That even the ghost didn't leave us, Bethy returned, not to comfort but to lure, to break what was barely holding together. That night, we didn't enter. We set the cabin ablaze, and we watched it burn from the hill. The scream that came from inside didn't belong to a child. It didn't belong to anything that should have ever had a mouth. Tojo said nothing, but I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't the end. This was the opening. We had broken something sacred, and now the forest was awake, watching, learning, becoming. After the cabin burned, we didn't speak for a long time. The flames had climbed high into the sky, casting a sickly green light across the hilltops. It wasn't like any fire I'd seen before. It didn't crackle, it hissed, as if the walls themselves were screaming in protest, as if something within was fighting to stay unburned. We stood in silence, and the forest watched with us. Tojo's face looked carved from stone jaw, clenched, hands trembling slightly. He didn't cry. He didn't curse. He just stared. The wind picked up, and with it came the distant echo of laughter, soft, childlike, echoing through the trees like it had nowhere to die. We left that hill before the fire burned out. We didn't take the trails. Not anymore. Tojo said they were compromised. He said they used them now. He didn't explain who they were. We hiked north for 3 days, living off melted snow and canned beans. The cold didn't bite as hard anymore. It was like the forest was changing its rules, adjusting itself for a different kind of hunt. On the 4th morning, I woke up to find carvings on my arms. They weren't wounds, not fresh ones anyway. Just patterns, spirals, runes. Inked beneath the skin like I'd been born with them and only now noticed. I panicked, scrubbing, scratching, crying. Toho didn't look surprised. He just said, "It's starting." That day, he told me everything. Not all of it, but enough. He wasn't born in the city like I thought. He'd come from here, from under the forest. A village that no longer existed on any map. A place where people didn't worship gods, they fed them. The villagers believed in sacrifice, not blood, but memory. They offered their dreams, their names, their pasts, feeding the forest, their identities to keep the deeper things asleep. But one day, someone refused, someone remembered. That's when the forest began to rot. Tojo had been just a child when he ran. He didn't remember his parents' faces. The forest had taken those memories, but he remembered running barefoot through the frost, clutching a black box, told only one thing: never return. Never open it. He never told me why he broke that rule. Maybe desperation, maybe fate. But whatever was inside that box, it had teeth. Now the old rules were unraveling. The things that fed on silence and grief were stirring again, finding cracks in the world. And we were being hunted. Not by animals, by memories. On the seventh day, we found the church, or what was left of it. It stood in a clearing, choked with bramble, half swallowed by the trees. Its roof had collapsed inward, and the bell tower leaned sideways like a drunk man trying to whisper a secret. But the door was still intact, sealed with strips of fabric marked in the same runes as those on my skin. Tojo froze when he saw it. This place shouldn't still be here. We entered anyway. Inside, the air felt wrong. Not cold. Not damp. Empty. Not like a room, but a mouth that had just swallowed something whole. The pews were gone, replaced by hundreds of dolls. Each one handmade. Each one missing a face. Their heads turned toward the altar, where something pulsed beneath a stained cloth slow, rhythmic, like a second heart. Tojo walked forward without hesitation. I followed, trembling. At the altar, he pulled away the cloth. Beneath it, a book, bound in leather so dark it looked like oil, pages stitched together with what I prayed wasn't hair. It smelled of copper and wet bark. When he opened it, the room shifted. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean the room moved. The walls stretched outward. The dolls turned their heads. The trees outside pressed against the stained glass, warping it with pressure. Something beneath the floor began to thump in time with the heartbeat of the book. Tojo flipped through the pages, reading aloud in a tongue I didn't recognize. The runes on my arms began to glow, faint but steady. My heartbeat synced with the room. And then I remembered something. Something I wasn't supposed to. The sound of a door slamming shut. The smell of sulfur. A man's voice, pleading. "You don't have to do this!" And my own smaller voice, whispering, "I'm sorry." Then silence. The kind that tastes like ash. He collapsed. When I woke, the church was gone. Tojo was dragging me through snow, eyes bloodshot, lips cracked. "We triggered something," he muttered. "The forest remembers you now." I asked him what that meant. His answer was a whisper. "You were here before." He wouldn't say more. That night, we took shelter in a cave marked with charcoal drawings. Primitive, ugly, powerful. Stick figures with crowns of bone. Trees with mouths. A giant eye staring from beneath the earth. I asked him if these drawings were warnings or instructions. He didn't know. But we slept inside anyway. And in my dreams, I returned to the forest, but it was alive. Its trees breathed. Its rivers bled. Its animals spoke, not with mouths, but with stolen memories, flashing images of childhood, laughter, war, betrayal. And at its center stood the tree from before, the one we'd visited with the mask. But now it was bigger, and it knew my name. I woke screaming. Tojo held me until dawn. Neither of us spoke. We knew now this wasn't about escape anymore. This was about return. The forest wasn't punishing us. It was calling us back. To finish what we'd started. To settle what had been buried. To face the things we ran from. On the 10th night, the stars vanished. Not behind clouds. They just stopped existing. The sky turned to ink. The trees hummed. And from every direction came footsteps, not loud, but many. A procession. Tojo handed me a blade. "We ended at the roots," he said. And I believed him, because by then I had started remembering more. The ritual, the circle, the masks, the fire, and the boy they left behind. Me. The procession moved silently, threading through skeletal trees that seemed to lean closer with each step we took. I gripped the blade Tojo had given me tighter, feeling its cold weight anchor me to the world. Around us, the forest pulsed like a living thing, its breath cold against my skin, its heartbeat hammering beneath the earth. We did not speak. There was no need. We both knew what awaited. After days of wandering, guided by faint marks carved into tree trunks, some ancient, some fresh, we reached the clearing. It was as if the forest had held its breath for centuries, now exhaling its darkest secret. The clearing was enormous. ringed by towering oaks with gnarled roots that reached outward like the hands of sleeping giants. At its center stood the tree. Not the tree we had seen before, no. This was the heart. A vast, twisting mass of bark and shadow that stretched impossibly into the blackened sky. Its branches blotting out the stars, its roots burrowed deep, vanishing into the earth like veins of living stone. The air was thick with something ancient and terrible, like the memory of every pain and sacrifice ever made beneath these branches. Tojo stopped at the edge of the clearing, eyes closed, lips moving in a silent prayer. "Do you remember?" he whispered. I did not answer, because I did. Flashbacks struck me in waves. A child's laughter trapped in frozen snow, a fire burning too bright, a black box clasped tight in small, desperate hands. Faces I did not recognize and yet somehow knew. Whispers in a language older than memory. A promise made beneath these very branches. And then, the betrayal, the sacrifice. My own scream swallowed by the forest. I looked at Tojo. "You're sure this is the place?" He nodded, face pale. "It's where it all began, and where it must end." We stepped forward. Roots shifted beneath our feet, as if the forest were waking, rising to meet us. From the shadows, figures emerged. Not human, not quite. Their skin was bark, their eyes glowing with amber light. They moved without sound, circling us, watching. The guardians of the heart. I raised my blade, the metal gleaming cold and sure. One stepped forward. Its voice was the rustle of leaves and the crack of dead branches. "You carry the blood of the past," Tojo answered, voice steady. "We come to end the curse." The guardian's eyes narrowed. "Do you bear the key?" Tojo reached into his jacket and pulled out the black box. It pulsed softly, a heartbeat in the palm of his hand. The guardians closed in. Suddenly, the ground trembled. The heart shuddered, releasing a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the clearing. The sky darkened further. Branches twisted, reaching down like claws. The guardians raised their voices, a haunting, discordant chant that filled the air. I felt the runes on my arms burn brighter. The box in Tojo's hand began to glow. Then it happened. A figure stepped out of the shadows behind us. A boy, but not like any boy I had ever seen. His eyes were empty voids, black holes that swallowed light. His smile was a rictus of pain and malice. He held a mirror cracked and ancient, reflecting a distorted version of the forest. "I am the memory you refused," he said. Voice cold and hollow. "You left me to rot beneath your fear." Tojo stepped forward, anger and sorrow twisting his features. "You were never meant to be alone." The boy laughed, a sound like shattering glass. "Alone is all I've ever known." The forest around us twisted, trees bending and writhing like living things. The ground cracked open beneath the heart. From the fissures rose shadows, nightmares given shape. The guardians lunged to hold them back. Tojo grabbed the box and threw it to me. "Run." I caught it, heart pounding. The boy advanced. I raised the blade, but it felt useless. The shadows closed in. Time slowed. I remembered the ritual, the circle, the fire, the names, the sacrifices. Then a voice inside me spoke, clear, unyielding. "Remember." I closed my eyes, whispered the names I had forgotten, each one a thread weaving through the forest darkness. Each one a promise. Each one a key. The box glowed brighter. I opened it. Inside was a mirror, not cracked, but whole, clear as truth. I raised it toward the boy. He screamed, a sound that cracked the sky. The shadows writhed, dissolving into mist. The forest trembled. The heart pulsed, then cracked. Light poured out, blinding, pure, and warm. When I opened my eyes, the clearing was empty. The tree was gone. The sky was clear. The stars returned. Tojo collapsed beside me, exhausted but smiling. "We did it," he whispered. I nodded, But deep inside, I knew it was only the beginning. Because the forest remembered. And so did I. The clearing was quiet now, but the silence felt heavier than the growl of the forest just moments before. The stars overhead blinked back into existence, cold and indifferent, like distant witnesses to the suffering below. I sat on the damp earth, my breath ragged, my fingers trembling as I clutched the mirror from the black box. Tojo lay beside me, sweat and dirt smeared on his face, exhaustion etched deep into his bones, but a small, tired smile tugged at the corners of his lips. Together, the dawn's pale light filtered through the broken canopy, casting long, trembling shadows over the forest floor. The air felt different, lighter, yet still charged with the echo of the night's terrors. As Tojo and I stood in the clearing where the curse had finally loosened its grip, I realized that what we faced now was something far more daunting than any specter or shadow creature. It was the reckoning of the soul, the unforgiving weight of choice. We had released Kaido's spirit from the prison of darkness, but what remained was the legacy he left behind, not just the fractured village or the haunted woods, but the fractured pieces of ourselves, splintered by pain, fear, and guilt. Tojo's shoulders sagged as he stared at the remnants of the black box, the mirror, now dull and cracked in places. "I never thought it would end like this," he whispered, voice raw with exhaustion and regret. I nodded, swallowing hard. Neither did I, but it's not over yet. His eyes met mine, searching for something: hope, forgiveness, an answer. "We have to face the village," I said firmly. "They've lived in silence and fear for too long. The truth needs to be told, even if it burns." Tojo hesitated, then slowly nodded. The path back to the village was treacherous, not because of the forest, but because of the ghosts waiting there. The village lay at the edge of the forest, a cluster of weathered wooden houses, smoke curling lazily from chimneys like fragile fingers reaching for redemption. Yet the weight of years of fear had left the streets empty, the faces wary and drawn. We were met with silence, then whispered rumors. The elders gathered, their eyes shadowed with disbelief and sorrow as Tojo began to speak. "I was wrong," he confessed openly, voice cracking with shame. "I blamed myself for Kaido's disappearance, but I was blind to what the forest was doing to him, to all of us. The curse was not just on the land, but in our hearts." The village listened, some with tears, others with anger. "You kept this from us," one elder spat. "You left us in darkness." Tojo bowed his head. "I was afraid. I thought I could fight it alone, but I was weak." I stepped forward, voice steady. "We released Kaido's spirit tonight. The curse is lifted, but healing will take time." The villagers' faces softened, but old wounds do not heal easily. The weight of generations pressed upon them like an invisible chain. That night I found myself alone, walking beneath the silver stars once more. Tojo sat quietly by the fire, his face a mask of contemplation. The forest around us seemed peaceful, yet I could feel the tremor beneath the calm. The battle outside was over. The battle inside had only just begun. I thought of Kaido, not the shadow boy, but the lost child yearning for freedom, love, and understanding. His story was a mirror to all our own hidden scars, the unspoken grief we carried like a second skin. In the days that followed, the village slowly awoke from its slumber. The walls built by fear began to crumble as stories were shared, tears were shed, and apologies whispered like prayers. Tojo became a beacon not because he was strong, but because he dared to be vulnerable. He led the villagers in reclaiming their history, honoring Kaido's memory not with silence, but with truth. Yet even as peace seemed to settle, the forest whispered warnings. One evening, a stranger arrived, cloaked in shadows, eyes gleaming with a knowledge that sent chills down my spine. "You think you have won?" the stranger hissed. "The forest is alive, and its heart beats beyond your grasp. Freedom is a choice, but so is bondage." The villagers recoiled, fear rising anew. Tojo stepped forward, unflinching. "We face the past, no matter how dark. The stranger smiled, a cold, knowing curl of the lips. Then be ready, because some shadows never leave. That night, sleep evaded me. The forest song was no longer a lullaby, but a challenge. We had fought the curse, but the true battle, the battle for our souls, was still to come. And I knew, deep in my bones, that to save what remained, we would have to choose who we truly were, and who we were willing to become. The night pressed in like a living thing, thick with silence that screamed louder than any voice. The village lay half asleep, shadows pooling beneath the doors and windows like dark water waiting to swallow the world whole. I couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger's words were more than a threat, they were a prophecy. The forest wasn't just a place, it was a force, ancient and hungry, tangled with every heartbeat, every secret buried deep beneath our skin. Tojo sat by the fire, eyes heavy but burning with a fierce resolve. The villagers gathered around, wary yet desperate for hope. "We have one chance left," he said, voice steady. "We must confront the forest's heart, the root of the curse, and face what waits there." A hush fell over the crowd. "Who will come with me?" Tojo's gaze swept across the faces, some fearful, some defiant. I stepped forward without hesitation. "I'm with you." Others followed, a small group bound by fear, hope, and a will to survive. The journey back into the forest was different this time. No longer were we just visitors in the shadows. We were challengers, armed with the truth, and a fierce determination to break the cycle. The trees closed in around us like ancient sentinels, their twisted limbs whispering secrets older than memory. The ground beneath our feet pulsed, as if the forest itself was alive, aware, watching. Suddenly, a chilling wind cut through the air, carrying a voice so low it was almost swallowed by the rustling leaves. "You think you can undo what was written in blood and shadow?" it hissed. From the darkness emerged the stranger, no longer cloaked, but fully revealed. Eyes gleaming like coals, features sharp and cruel. "I am the Keeper," he said, voice heavy with ancient power. "I guard the balance. The forest is a mirror. It reflects what you hide inside." Tojo stepped forward, fists clenched. "We don't hide anymore." The Keeper smiled, a blade flashing in the night. "Then show me your truth." What followed was not a battle of swords or spells, but a reckoning of souls. The forest shifted, warping around us, visions rising like smoke from the ground. I saw Kaido, not as the shadow, but as the boy he had been laughing, afraid, lost. I saw Tojo, haunted by guilt, his heart a battlefield of regret and love. And I saw myself, the hidden fears, the broken promises I had buried deep. The Keeper's voice echoed through the visions. "Face yourself. Only then can the curse be broken." Each of us was forced to confront the darkest parts of ourselves. Memories flooded back, the choices we'd tried to forget, the pain we'd tried to hide. I relived the moment I first met Kaido, the silent promise I made to protect him, and the moments I failed. Tojo saw his own failures, the walls he built to shield himself that only deepened the wounds. Others faced their fears, their regrets, their shadows. And as we confronted these inner demons, the forest began to change. The oppressive weight lifted, replaced by a fragile light. But the Keeper was not done. "True freedom comes with sacrifice," he warned. Then, in a voice that trembled between command and sorrow, he said, "Who will pay the price?" The group fell silent, the gravity of his words sinking deep. Tojo looked at me, eyes filled with a mixture of hope and pain. "I will," he said quietly. "No," I replied, shaking my head. "We do this together." But he smiled sadly. "Some burdens are mine alone." Before I could protest, he stepped forward into the glowing heart of the forest, a place where time seemed to fold in on itself, where the air shimmered with power. The ground trembled, and a brilliant light engulfed him. I felt his presence fade, but also a strange peace settling over the forest. The Keeper nodded solemnly. "He has paid the price." And then, with a final, echoing whisper, the curse shattered like glass breaking under the weight of truth. The forest breathed a sigh, the darkness dissolving into dawn. Tojo was gone, but his sacrifice had freed us all. We returned to the village, forever changed, scarred, but stronger. The shadows had not disappeared completely, but they no longer ruled us. They had been faced, named, and finally understood. That night, I stood beneath the stars, feeling the weight of loss and the glimmer of hope. Kaito's spirit was free, Tojo's courage a beacon, and the forest, once a prison, now a place of quiet promise. And as I closed my eyes, I knew the story was not just theirs. It was ours. A story of pain, courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable strength of the human heart. The village lay silent under a sky slowly bleeding hues of dawn. The heavy burden of what had happened still hung in the air, like a thick fog, the sacrifice of Tojo, the breaking of the curse, and the fragile promise of peace. But peace, I had learned, was never simply the absence of darkness. It was a battle, a choice, a light we had to carry even when our hands trembled. I walked through the quiet streets, each step heavy with memory. Faces I'd known, laughter I'd heard, all marked now by the echo of loss and the whisper of hope. Kaito's absence was a hollow ache inside me, but I could feel his presence everywhere, in the wind, in the trembling leaves, in the quiet moments before dawn. The forest had changed too. No longer a prison of shadows, it breathed with life renewed. But its power was still wild and ancient, a reminder that the past never truly dies. It waits for us to face it. I found myself at the edge of the clearing where Tojo had made his final stand. The earth was still warm beneath my feet. I knelt, laying a hand on the soil, feeling the pulse of his sacrifice, the unspoken love that had driven him. A sudden breeze stirred, soft and warm, carrying a faint whisper in a language older than time. Carry the light, protect the future. Those words settled deep inside me, a spark igniting in the darkness. I realized then that this story, our story, was not about endings. It was about beginnings. The villagers began to stir, drawn by the dawn and the promise it carried. Eyes met mine, and in their depths I saw not just grief, but strength, a fierce determination to rebuild, to heal, to live. We had been broken, shattered by loss and fear, but like the forest itself, we could grow again stronger, wiser, more alive. The boy who had been lost to the shadows was free. The old woman who had guided us all, her wisdom etched in every word, watched with quiet pride. And I stood ready to carry the light forward. But there was one final truth I needed to face. The darkness we had fought was not just outside us. It lived inside, in the fears we buried, the regrets we carried, the wounds we hid. To truly be free, we had to forgive ourselves and each other. So, beneath the rising sun, I gathered the village. We spoke of our fears, our mistakes, our hopes. We cried, we laughed, we shared the weight of our scars. And in that sharing, the last chains broke. The forest's curse was lifted not just by Tojo's sacrifice, but by the courage of every heart willing to face its own shadow. The days that followed were filled with quiet miracles. Fields began to bloom where once there was only ash. Children played beneath the trees that had once whispered threats. And the village, once cloaked in fear, shone with a new light, fragile, yes, but fierce and unbreakable. I often thought of Tojo in those days. How his courage had saved us all. How his love was the seed from which this new life had grown. And I knew, no matter what darkness came, we would face it together. This is the story of shadows faced and fears conquered, of sacrifice that blossoms into hope, of a family forged not by blood, but by love and choice. Now, dear friend, the story lives with you. In your own fears, your own battles, your own shadows, may you find the strength to face them, to carry the light forward, no matter how dark the night. Because every ending is a new beginning, and every heart holds the power to change the story. If this journey touched your soul, share it with those who need light in their darkness. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that inspire, heal, and remind us all of our courage. And remember, you are never alone. The light is always within. Thank you for walking this path with me. Until the next story, keep shining, keep fighting, and keep loving.